So pleased to be able to have Rose here with us today. Rose is one of our upcoming artists in residence, as we all know, and she has graciously agreed to share with us what she called her code of ethics, and really some of the things that inform her practice, the decisions that she makes, some of her background and how that shows up in her work or her just ideation, which I think will help us as we experiment and learn together through this residency process. Rose lives and works in the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico. She has a BFA from the University of New Mexico and an MFA from RISD, MA in creative writing from the Institute of American Indian Arts. Her sculptures are in the collections of many museums, including the MFA Boston Denver Art Museum and Peabody Essex Museum. She recently had a year-long solo exhibition at the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And in 2019, her works were also included in some pretty great exhibitions, including Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, and Radical Love at the Ford Foundation. Her first solo exhibition was at Jessica Silverman Gallery, and that was in 2019. And I'm also pleased to have Beryl and Jessica here from the gallery too, who got up way early San Francisco time to join us. So I really appreciate that. And that kind of does it with the formalities. Rose, if you want to take it away, we're here for you.
Good morning, everybody. I know it's not as early some places than it is for some other people, and it may not be morning for some. Happy day to everybody. Thank you for having me. It's really kind of cool to put together this kind of presentation because it's not what I normally do, which is kind of cool. So it's really fun. It's always a good reflection to take a moment and ask myself, like, what do I really want to say? And so this should be cool. I'm going to start and share my screen. What I had called, what I want to talk about kind of before we started our project was my code of ethics. And I think it's really strongly based on my background. And I feel like there's a lot of information out there that we can look at, like what I make and where it is and those kinds of nuts and bolts. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, what drives my decisions very specifically. And so, I call this one the how and the why, and it's because, like, growing up in the Pueblo, there was this joke where if you did something wrong, they'd say, that's not the how, that's not the how, that's not, you know, it's not the how, this is the how, that's not the how. And I always thought about like what that means, and then how that's really linked with the why, and when something's not the how, there's a reason, because it's also very interlinked with the why. And it sort of all is based on this relationship to where we all come from. And even though I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo and I have a lot of really strong influences, I try and focus on how much we are all sort of siblings on this planet, and this is our mother, right? And this is a very clear thing for me that I always consider, that we're in this large relationship, and it's always really important to remember, you know, who's in charge really. And so I try and keep that sort of in the forefront of everything that I do. Yeah, and also we can see on this photo, you know, the continent that I call home, and it's an important place. And place being, you know, always mixed in with everything that I do. And it's really, you know, I think a lot about how the extraction of place from our identity often sort of leads us astray, and we forget the how and the why. So this is a drawing that I did actually before I was a mom, and I always thought about our relationships to ourselves and each other, and sort of the nurturing responsibility. So where I come from, you're actually not a woman until you're a mother, and you're not a man until you're a father. And the point is that the point of your life and your adulthood is actually around the act of nurturing, and nurturing being the most important thing you could possibly do in the world. And the ultimate nurturer is mother, right? And so, you know, the biggest honor and the biggest respect comes from the biggest nurturer. And so, you know, the most respect and the most honor you can get is how much you give away, how much you can offer and share in a community. And I've been always sort of struggling with that as a sort of independent and selfish person in a lot of ways. And I've thought a lot about what nurturing and giving looks like throughout my life, and I'll go more into that. So I come from Santa Clara Pueblo. I really like this photograph on the left, which was taken around the turn of the last century, obviously. And we have a really, really strong relationship to clay. And so my ancestry, my matrilineal side, because clay, working with clay was actually the job of women. It went back really, really far as probably the innovation of clay itself came into the Southwest around, I think, 500 current era. So, you know, it was really interesting is we have a very, very, very deep relationship to clay and the nurturing aspect of clay. Specifically, clay became a really strong relationship for Pueblo people because of its capacity to nurture and hold nourishment and medicine and water and those things that are the most important parts of life. Although when I went to school in Rhode Island and studied ceramics, I realized that we have a very young and immature relationship with clay compared to other cultures in the world that I didn't know about, like, you know, Korean ceramics and Japanese ceramics and Chinese ceramics. I have a lot of respect for the history there, but I do feel like my specific cultural relationship to clay is very spiritual, and it has become very ingrained in the culture itself. So the piece that you see here on the right of the screen is a piece that's now in the collection of the Portland Art Museum, and it's actually a low relief ceramic tile with mud plaster on board. And I actually, it's from a photograph of one of my relatives from around 1910. So there was something about being in graduate school where I struggled a lot with what people thought and the stereotypes around what a Native American is. And what I was trying to get across was less of the exotification and more of the energy of the intensity around the cultural preservation and post-colonial stress disorder that comes with it. I really like this photo on the left is from Isleta Pueblo, which is directly south of Albuquerque. That's also my daughter's patrilineal tribe. And my the picture on the right is my mother and my grandmother plastering actually my mom's gallery. We all came together and fixed up this tower, this adobe tower for her gallery, but we all worked together, all the generations, even the little kids were crawling around on the floor. And I feel that my relationship to earth, whether it's clay or the adobe that we build our houses out of, or the earth that we grow our food from, is very, very, still a very, very strong connection. And specifically through my family, because we're kind of strong-willed people. This is an important figure in the Southwest. Her name is Maria Martinez, and she was one of the more famous cultural figures in the ceramics world for this area. She comes from the tribe directly south of ours, which is San Ildefonso Pueblo, and they speak the same language. I think there's 9 different languages in the area, and so not very many tribes speak the same language. But Maria Martinez was a Tewa woman from San Ildefonso, and her husband created innovated a new style of ceramics, which was black on black pottery, which I'll get into a little later. But what's interesting about what I'm trying to show is the sort of very strong women community of women that I come from, and these really matriarchal communities and you know, people that you know, where nurturing and the power of the woman is pretty much pivotal in the cultural identity. And Maria Martinez, a funny story about her is that her and her husband actually made a name for themselves in you know, in the early 1900s for their ceramics, right? So it was collector's items. So everyone in the community would start bringing her their pots and say, sign it. And then she'd sell it as hers, and so that she could give back to the community, because that goes back to that idea of nurturing, where it didn't matter if she were keeping with the rules or whatever. It was just how can she benefit her entire community best at the time, which I think is really cool and says a lot about her nature. This is my mom and myself inside the coil there. My mom is giving a presentation, I believe, outside of Portland when I was a kid. And as a child, me and my brother traveled everywhere with my mom, who was a professional artist. And so I got to watch her give presentations and lectures all throughout my life. And I really like this photo because, you know, I was always sort of right beside her in that. And because she came from a really strong, you know, mothering world, that there was no doubt that she took her kids with her everywhere. That we just went with her to every slideshow, every lecture, every class, every gallery opening. We were there, which is I think I'm realizing what a privilege that gave me in my neural pathway of what's possible. And I'm also dragging my kid everywhere too. And this is my mom and her work. This was one of our first collaborations, sort of professional collaborations that we did, where she made a large mother and I actually made the baby that went inside it for a museum show at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe. So my mom, my grandmother was a potter, my great-grandmother was a potter, and my mother couldn't speak. She had a speech impediment as a child, so she would grab her mom's clay and make little figures to try and communicate herself to her mom. And so, you know, without being really professionally trained, she taught herself how to make very incredible figures out of clay, which is very contemporary. It wasn't traditional pots. And so because of her work, I believe I was able to branch out in the directions that I've gone. And then also the meeting that I'm on the board of Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute, which is also of the many boards I'm on, this is one. And this is the one that's the most dear to my heart. And this is an institute my mom started when I was a kid in the 80s. And it's, you know, a 501c3 that focuses on cultural preservation and sustainable farming practices. And this is my nephew and my niece when they were little playing in the cornfield. And I think that relationship to our environment and our agricultural aspects of things are really important. So here's a definition of permaculture. Is a system of agricultural and social design principles centered around simulating or directly utilizing the patterns and features observed in natural ecosystems. Some people break it down simply to permanent agriculture, but also permanent culture. So how do we sustain humanity on the planet more sustainably than we have? And what I believe my mother's perspective of starting this Permaculture Institute was that if we simply mimic our historical ways of relating to the environment, we're doing permaculture, because traditionally Indigenous people understood what permaculture was and did that anyway. So it's basically cultural preservation in a lot of ways. And so as a child, my mom and my stepdad would also teach permaculture design courses. So we travel all over the state. In our household, we didn't have any electricity and we sustained ourselves off of about 3/4 of an acre of land. We grew all the food for our family there, and I was homeschooled, and we just spent all our time, you know, playing with our food, basically in the fields and playing with animals. But I got to watch. As a child, I would sit and watch my stepdad and my mom talk about permaculture design courses, permaculture design and sustainability and energy transitions and transformation. And there was so much theory around what is sustainability when it comes to farming practices. And as a kid, you know, I was out there weeding the beans for hours and hours and days, and like my cousins were all sitting around watching MTV and eating McDonald's, and I hated it. I was like, no, this is terrible. This is horrible. And so what I realized is that it's beautiful. Yeah, permaculture makes a whole lot of sense. It's absolutely where we need to go, but we can't skip steps. And the steps that were being skipped were our internal spaces, our psychological and spiritual spaces, that we can't deny ourselves and our humanity. Any place that we're in denial of something and we're compromising too much becomes a tension and a glitch. And if we're miserable, absolutely miserable, growing all our own food, we missed something. And so I believe that my entire approach to my art practice is, how do we make that the choice? How do we make every healthy decision the one that fits and doesn't compromise our soul and our spirit? And so I've basically, my art practice has been, how do we transform sort of permaculturally and sustainably from the inside? And if we can be as conscious as we possibly can with our internal workings, physically, spiritually, psychologically, then we are going to make healthier choices on the outside. And we're going to choose to eat something healthy because it feels good in our body, and not because we wanted to go to McDonald's and jump around in the ball pit, right? There's like, and that very simple experience made me realize that the type of permaculture that I wanted to do was internal and social. And so a lot of these patterns, how do these fit within our psychological states, and how do these fit within social constructs and cultures? So I go to graduate school at RISD, and you know, I call myself a sculptor who chooses clay, right? So I wouldn't call myself a ceramicist. I like ceramics, I can geek out on it, but I'm not a ceramics dweeb 100%, right? I like to choose a material because it fits the intention. And the reason I continue to choose clay is because clay is, when it's in its plastic moldable form, and also before it's fired, it's full of water, just like our bodies. And I tried in graduate school, my entire graduate challenge was, how do I talk about the power of intention and the power of, I wanted to say prayer, but you can't do that, right? So how do I talk about the intentionality that we're in as we make something? Because the water listens. The water in the clay is listening to you. The water in the earth is listening to you as you plant your corn. The adobes of the house you're building is actually aware and conscious. And how could I explain that? So I studied Masaru Emoto wrote this book called Hidden Messages in Water. And all it was a practice where he spoke to water negatively and then positively, and then froze them and photographed the ice crystals, or drops, and photographed the difference that the water actually looked like physically after intention was imbued in it. And that was a big part of my thesis, was how clay actually responds to the how we approach something actually changes what it is. I am a very spiritual person, and I was raised, continuing our traditional practices. And a lot of that is that if you get enough people in the same place believing in nurturing and the goodness of our relationship to this planet, we actually can make change. And I've seen with my own eyes people turn a hot 100-degree day into a rainstorm because we believed. And because I've experienced that, I believe in the power of art and how that can transform our world and can really, really, really transform our collective power to make things better. And so I've always been trying to straddle this line, and I'll talk a little bit more about appropriation and exploitation, but I've tried to take what I really believe and that dedication to our spiritual practices that have come a long way, and only have come a long way because they've been tried and true and work, right? So it's permaculture, it's cultural preservation. We keep doing it because it keeps working, and we've been through a lot of we're survivors of genocide, and we continue to navigate the world through our cultural belief systems, which is a privilege, and it's absolutely amazing. And a lot of cultures have been incredibly appropriated and exploited and abused. And I think because Pueblo people were some of the first people in this area to be colonized by the Spanish, the Catholics, that we learned early on how to not share too much and how to keep secrets, because if you tell too much, you get hurt, right? And your people get murdered and all kinds of horrible things happen. So a lot of Pueblo people, our belief systems went underground, and we don't talk about it and we don't share it. A lot of the cultures in the Americas who were colonized later, like I would say the Northern Plains people, you know, they were more willing to share their cultural belief systems with people, and it's been incredibly exploited. That's why when we think of a Native American, we think of the stereotype of that. We don't think of the thousands of different types of cultures that exist on this island, on this continent, right? And so what I try to do is, instead of talk directly from the spiritual source that I come from, I try and think about what is it about Pueblo people that is human, that is pan-human, that is something that human beings know across the planet. And if we just dig inside of ourselves, we'll find that without taking anything from anyone else and getting anyone hurt in the process. And so a lot of my work, like this one here, is like, how do we search and build the perspective and look deep enough or far enough to identify that thing that I really truly believe in everyone, because I believe there's that source of humanity that we can get to, and I believe that is psychological, that's spiritual, that's emotional, and that's why I make this type of work, because this is a piece I made at RISD. It was one of the first slab pieces. So I was experimenting with how gestural I could be and how powerful that gesture can be when it comes from that space of direct human acknowledgement of our vulnerable places. And so you can see how the clay responds to me being in the space of what do I want to say and how do I find that humanity and how vulnerable can I be, and then how can I put it in the clay and turn it into something that may speak or sort of twang that part in humans around the world. And part of it is these, and I feel there's so much power in our hands, you know, like we work and we create and the fact that we can transform visions into reality through our hands is so human. It's so human forever and ever. This is actually I got to mine the collection in the Pomona College Museum of Art and do a big interactive show around the work. And I went into the basement where they had all this sort of pillaged artifacts from Native people. And they were bringing in Native artists to engage the collection. And there's a lot of beautiful beadwork. There was a lot of beautiful tapestries and textiles and basketry and pottery that was incredibly painted beautifully. And I noticed the stones that were used to nurture people, that being grinding stones and fishing weights and axes, where stone was worked with our hands enough to nourish everyone. And that being what holds, what has the kind of density to hold intention like a stone. And this being very human and across the board, around the world, innate to our being. And so I pulled out stones from the basement, and I built. I actually took them out in the sun. They hadn't been in the sun for 100 years. And I pulled them out in the sun, and I put them in the dirt, and I took off my gloves, and I touched them with my hands and put them against my heart and let them warm up because they'd been so cold. But that kind of intention, I find, is can we turn that into a pan-human thing rather than, oh, that's what Indians do and that's their thing, you know? It's like, no, this is people. And I've done all kinds of things to try and connect, right? It's like, how best can I connect and find that? I've been in a lot of bands. I've done a lot of singing and performance. This is my experimental punk band that traveled all over, called Chocolate Helicopter. And we had a lot of fun. And I think that experience was incredibly important to me to find the power of that really vulnerable moment, and screaming into a microphone as loud as you can and smashing it around and being as raw and vulnerable was really empowering, and deconstructed a lot of the judgments about what you're supposed to do. This is a stained glass piece that's like 2 stories tall that I designed and someone else made, you know, and there's that, like, it's in a casino nearby here, and you can see the dress that the dancer descending the staircase is wearing is like our traditional regalia, and it was a political jab at tribes and casinos, you know, what are we praying for now, really, you know? And so that kind of industrial perspective of how much that reaches people, and there's a huge percentage of weddings that get photographed in front of this, and graduations, and it's so funny because nobody knows it's me, but this is like a very iconic piece of art in northern New Mexico because everyone's so proud of it, and it was kind of an internal jab, you know. I find it funny, but it's one way of reaching out, from big to really small, experimenting with what kind of effect you can make with art. When I was a little kid, my mom used to wear broomstick skirts, right? And I used to, if I had wet hands, I would go find her dress, right, and then dry off, right? Or when I was little, I would curl up in her skirt and hide. Like if we were at the grocery store or something and someone scared me, I'd just curl up in her dress. And so when I was at RISD, I was so fed up with how everyone acted like 2-year-olds. And I was like, everybody just needs a mom skirt to roll up in. So, you know, 60 yards of fabric later, and I created this experience for myself. And it didn't work, you know, but you know, what is the fabric workshop, or what is art, you know, to experiment and see what works, right? Is it drawing? I started doing these things, these layered drawings where I was drawing forms and then layering tissue and drawing on top of them, and then I started doing it with clay, and I was calling them transparencies, and how vulnerable can we be and what do we want to share, and all those things about, you know, finding our humanity and being as vulnerable, and then also as tough, and as sort of like, where do we enter into spaces that are you know, divergent or illegal, I guess to say. I used to paint a lot of trains, and I lived in Albuquerque, and I was really very active in the graffiti world in Albuquerque, which was really interesting because I was one of the only women at the time that were doing that. And now this is at Western New Mexico University. I actually go around and teach can control workshops. So I teach people how to use spray paint cans, which actually segues into painting cars, but we'll get there later. But the power of sort of illegal arts and painting on the side of a train, and who is your audience really, you know, like these young men here. And you know, this is a piece that I did, a collaboration of an honoring at the tribe for someone who was very dear to us that died of an overdose, a heroin overdose. And you know, how do we honor or you know, who our audience and what are we trying to say? And I think a lot about place and who our conversation is with and how best to have that conversation and what materials do we use. So the Pomona College Museum of Art show, I ended up making these 2 large figures, and one of them is actually reaching into the floor, and it has these 14-foot wings, and it's actually, you know, it has every ability to fly above and sort of rise above and over something. But there's actually a wall of ancestors with grinding stones, and they're telling them to go into the ground rather than above it. And that being it felt like a really powerful statement. And then to have this one I called Witness, and it's this sort of post-apocalyptic Indigenous person. It's like, hey, we've been through some craziness and we're trying to survive. And they go talk to the ancestors, and their nurturing comment is to go within and go deep. And these pieces are about, I think Witness is about 10 feet tall. So you can kind of see the size and the scale of those. And those pieces just practically have a metal infrastructure that was welded like a skeleton, and then fabric that's put over, and the clay pieces are only the heads, the hands, and the feet. And so and then the Witness's jacket was like mostly leather. It weighed like 200 pounds. Pretty cool. Going the wrong way, sorry. And then also really small pieces. So like this piece, when I went to RISD, I was really excited to go to RISD because they had this enormous kiln, right? I was like, oh, I'm gonna make work that the feet are in one room and the midsections in the next room, the second floor, and the heads in the third floor, and I'll have all this power, etc. And by the time I left, I was only using the 8-inch by 8-inch square test kiln. And I realized that a lot of power can actually be in this really intimate small space. And so this piece here is obviously 3 kinds of clay. One is adobe unfired bricks. One is this foot that's sort of the crumbled part of the reaching up and the jumping forward, and it's sort of post-apocalyptic, like, what happened? And I called it the answer that ended creation. And the idea is whenever we come to an answer of anything, we've stopped evolving. And we stop finding who we are and experimenting with what is our really true innate space. And I've been obsessed with post-apocalyptic theory because of growing up permaculture and knowing all these sort of ecological facts of what environmentally we're dealing with in the world. And also knowing sort of as a post-apocalyptic, you know, Indigenous people have survived genocide. So we're already in an apocalypse. This is it. This is our apocalypse. And we've survived it, which is all interesting. It's like, yeah, we're surviving this apocalypse, and we're being innovative and figuring out how to do this. And we could be more innovative. And I feel like the idea of an apocalypse is the ending of something and the beginning of something that's a lot more innovative and allowing for our true natures to show. Because I feel like our current social society is an avalanche of judgments and ideas of how we're supposed to express ourselves and our, you know, every single part of ourselves, from what we wear to how we be in the world. And I look forward to deconstructing that. And I feel like my work has a lot to do with how do we reclaim our power, and how do we even find what that power is in this world that's kind of, you know, has the recipe already given to us, and we haven't been able to find that on our own in a lot of ways. And so these pieces were from the directed series where I made these busts, and then I sort of adorned them with this post-apocalyptic vibrations that had them coming from different directions. This piece are two large figures that are facing each other in a large empty space. This one is interesting because it was the first piece that it was built around a conversation around spirituality specifically. I was collaborating initially with the actor Val Kilmer, who was really interested in art to start with and wanted access. And so was collaborating with me on that, but is also a very spiritual person, I would say, a religious person, and wanted our piece, our collaboration, to be about religion. Basically, it was like, let's create a sacred space. And I was like, how do we do that without being appropriating or exploitative or whatever? And you know, he was very theatrical. He wanted, you know, hot air balloons coming in from the side and walls disappearing. I was like, no, dude. How do we go deeper into that? And actually, it was a really intense, like, year-long conversation that we never figured it out. And he ended up getting really sick. And I had to finish the project without him. And what I realized was he had used the word altar. I want to create an altar, you know? And I was like, we can't use a church. We can't have a kiva, which is our sacred space. We can't have, like, you know, a sweat lodge, or like all the ways that we approach spirituality. But he had used the word altar. How can we create an altar? And I said, well, let's use that. I wanted to use that word, but change it from ALTAR to ALTER. And that altering space was the moment that we connect with someone else, being the most sacred moment, right? And that is more pan-human than very specific religion. And so I created these two large pieces, and you entered into the space. The tension between them was the altering moment, was the sacred space. This is my buds helping me set them up, and you can see how big they are. I'm gonna let you guys read it, because I have these, the pictures of you guys are covering part of my screen, so I can't see the words. Can everybody see the words? Okay, cool. So one of the strong sort of current issues that I'm navigating is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which is what MMIWG stands for. And the sexualization and appropriation and exotification of Indigenous women has had horrible consequences in Indigenous communities. And so if you look at some of these facts that I pulled, that we actually are facing an incredible crisis around Indigenous women going missing or being murdered, and nothing's happening about it. Myself, I know of, last night I just remembered someone else. So I know 4 women who have been murdered or disappeared that were my friends personally in my life. And nothing's come of it, right? They just, you know, and they think a lot of it, you know, there's a lot of perspective. One of them is that tribes are federal, they're not state, so they're basically have the same sovereignty as the state itself. So on a reservation, if someone gets murdered, the state can't do anything about it. They have to send in the FBI, and the FBI don't care. They don't have time for it. So there's that, where nothing gets followed through. And then also, because of that, there might be easy pickings that Indigenous women can be sold into slavery. And so appropriation, specifically in sexualization of Indigenous women, is so dangerous. So the image that I put here is actually a Halloween costume that you can buy online, right? And the sexualization and the exotification of Indigenous women, to me, is a loaded gun. It's one of the worst things that we can do, and this is something that I want to be very careful with. And this is why when I approach you know, performance art or my sculpture, or when I talk about what you know, a powerful woman is, it's not this. And I want to talk about what that means. some recent work that I did for Jessica Silverman's show in the fall, and talking about the way that clay holds that memory, is that as I was making these twins, a little girl from the tribe went missing. She was 5 years old. They found her 4 days later in the river upstream from my studio, maybe 3/4 of a mile from my studio. And my heart broke so bad, you know, while I was making these pieces, and I wanted to take that sort of broken heart of an issue that's absolutely real and pertinent. This was September of last year, and turn it into this like powerful prayer for change. And how do we do that, you know? And I ended up taking these pieces to the river and putting them in the water, sort of downstream from where they found that girl, to sort of put my prayer into the water that will cycle back through, and that prayer that will touch everything, that this changes, that we can make some really serious change around it. And the photographer Kate Russell came down and took some photos of that moment, which I thought were cool. And so here is my empowered women, empowered Indigenous women and queer people, gendered queer people, that have a lot to do with cars. So the drawing on the left is actually a drawing of myself draped over a Camaro motor engine, and it uses that sort of technique of translucency, or else transparency. And then the piece on the right was when I was pregnant for my daughter, and I turned myself into a V8 engine that was making this baby inside her stomach. So their little hole is a little pot inside the stomach, and there's a baby in there. And my relationship to cars has a lot to do with trauma. And so as I was bi local, my parents separated when I was a kid, and I went from house to house, and there was incredibly different challenges and different. My white father in Santa Fe had some going on that was really bad, and my res life here at the Pueblo had stuff that I needed to get away from. And so I bought my first car when I was 12. And the way that I kept that car going was I worked construction, and I worked on it myself. And all of a sudden that car resembled my freedom and my power to get away from really bad things. And so I really related to cars as a source of power and a way to transform a lot of my insecurities into an empowered space. So it's relational aesthetics in the way that it feeds my psychological state. So long story short, I went to RISD and I studied ceramics and relational aesthetics and performance art. And then all my buds were like, we're going to New York and do art. And I was like, cool, I'm going to go home and grow food. And I came back to Española, which happens to be lowrider capital of the world. And I was like, I'm going to go to school to build custom cars. So I went to Northern New Mexico College for 3 years for automotive science and auto body, which is classic car customization or collision repair, paint and body, right? And I had this 68 Buick Skylark, and I needed a drivetrain, and Buick parts are hard to find. So I got this 1985 El Camino on the side of the road that needed a lot of work. I decided that I'd fix up the body and then take out the drivetrain, put the drivetrain, which is the engine, transmission, differential drivetrain, into the Buick. But I ended up liking this car the more I worked on it. This is me taking down all the paint to bare metal. At school, we had to, we were being graded for this, so it had to be done really well. And one day, as I was working on the car, we took it to the field. My mom is on the right, and those are my nephews. And she was like, let's take that ugly thing to the field and use it for harvest, because the other truck, that's my other truck, the Ford in the back, is too high. The little kids can't put the food in the back. And so because El Camino is so low to the ground, it was a really good thing for harvest. And it hit me that it was a vessel, it was a pot, and so it made it really easy to choose to paint it like a pot. And this is me getting my buds to help me this is a pretty, there's a lot of women elbow grease on that car. These are my, you know, me teaching my buds how to work on cars and stuff with them, with it. I guess that was supposed to be there. That's, if you guys remember the piece where I'm a car, there's the baby inside of it. This is a lowrider from a car show in Española. So as a kid, so the town that I grew up next to, Española, is the lowrider capital of the world. And it basically has more lowriders per capita than like Orange County, California. And so as a kid, I saw all these custom classic cars. The town I'm from also is the heroin capital of the world. So it has some, it is New Mexico's armpit, of northern New Mexico's armpit. Like, people come to Santa Fe and then they like roll up their windows and lock their doors to drive to Taos, right? So Española has a really, really bad, you know, name. And I'm really proud to be from Española. But I realized that the reason that the lowriders were so powerful and so strong in this culture of lowriding was because of the hardship. And when you have such difficulty, you look for aesthetic and something to make you feel like there's a life worth living. And so these people who have burnt down trailers, like, you'll see a house that's completely disintegrating and the most beautiful car outside. And as long as those people can cruise through town a few times a week and feel proud of something, they make it through, and the culture becomes a really powerful thing. And so because of that, the culture of lowriding, I found a really amazing connection to relational aesthetics and the power of art itself, which goes back to permaculture, right? So if we make ourselves strong within, then we can make more powerful decisions. I also saw this movie as a kid called Once Were Warriors, and it's from New Zealand, and it's about Indigenous Maori experience in Auckland. I think it was like 91 or 92 that it came out. One part of the movie, this group of young men come and take one of the main characters who's there in the center in the front seat, and they drive off in this Chevy, in this 4-door Chevy. And I remember being like, oh my God, there's something so incredibly empowering in this image. And I was like, I want to feel this, you know? I don't want to appropriate and be a Maori person, but I can see that Indigenous pride and sort of re-energizing culture in a modern way, in a very strange, I approach it that way. It's badass. And here are Maria Martinez pots. And I know those are a strange shift for everybody, but to me, it feels the same. And that Maria Martinez, a potter in the very beginning, who was the person who sort of made black on black pottery famous. The feeling of this kind of pottery reminds me of our culture very specifically, and it is incredibly powerful and serious and beautiful and strong and like spiritual and so badass, like so badass. And it's the same kind of thing, right? So then I painted my El Camino like a Maria Martinez pot, which was it's actually a hot rod black with a gloss to make the black. And this is at the Denver Art Museum, which was kind of the catalyst to finish the car and get it to a point where I could do a performance. And this was the first performance I did with the car, where I got Indigenous women and genderqueer people to wear sort of these outfits that I made that sort of represented that post-apocalyptic empowerment. And we closed down some of the streets in Denver and drove the car and marched with it up the streets with the performers. And I like to call the performers transformers, because not like robot transformers, but like that space when you create a moment that you can actually become something else rather than pretend. And so the people that are participants in this experience, I asked them very specifically to participate so that they could empower a part of themselves, and have this feeling. And this is also because I was doing, this is a whole other thing, but I was doing fashion design, and I was participating in fashion shows, and I'd get a bunch of buds that are genderqueer, and I'd dress them up in this post-apocalyptic stuff, and they'd be all dragging their chains, and I'd be hiding behind the curtain, like watching them, you know, like, oh, what are they doing? And somebody was like, you're trying to sort of be a catalyst for change in the way that we look at Indigenous women, but you're not doing it yourself, right? And so this was a big moment because I ended up getting behind the wheel of the car and dressing myself up and participating in this, which was, you know, a very intense experience. And one of the most important parts of this was, aside from the car having headers and dual exhaust, which makes it really loud, right? So it's like, rah, 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 rah. And then I had behind the seats, there's a space big enough for a spare tire. I filled that entirely with speakers, with subwoofers. And so the car had this heartbeat. So it was like, doo, 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 doo. And we were like marching really slowly up the road. And it was the energy that I was trying to conjure was working, right? It made me scared, it made me vulnerable, but it also made me feel like there were other possibilities than what we've been given. I worked with Kate Russell, the photographer, to sort of document that in different ways, to try and see how far we could share that without, you know, dragging the car all over the place and redoing these things. These are some more photos of that. That's myself and one of my buds who's a genderqueer person. This is the dash. So I made that dash, which is kind of interesting, is I made the dash that you see here that looks kind of like an airplane dash. This is the dash of Maria from the inside. And the car is named after Maria Martinez. I don't know if I got that part. So the car is named Maria after Maria Martinez. But I was really pregnant with the kid, with Nugget, and I had to build the dash, but I couldn't weld. And so I used aircraft aluminum and like sheet metal screws. And so every part of the car has this kind of memory of an experience of being, I guess, transformational and revolutionary in the way that I approached it. And I really, the experience of taking up space, I think, is what is important about the car. And so this is Maria going up Canyon Road in Santa Fe with a crew, and, you know, holding up traffic and making noise and entering into a space where we don't owe an apology and we didn't have to interact, and we could take up that space and be there. And I think the neural pathway for Indigenous women and queer people is that you're not, you know, we've been subjugated to the point that we're going missing and murdered. And how do we flip that and we take up that space and we take a moment to re-empower ourselves? And that experience itself, I think, is a really amazing thing. Because this is my responsibility. This was yesterday. We were out in watering the fields, and there's something really amazing when the water hits the dry earth and you know, begins that process of seeds turning into food. And, you know, as a kid, I was always playing in the irrigation and the mud, and that being, you know, full circle. How do we remember what's important and make space for this kind of conversation? And this is my responsibility, this kid. This is my daughter, you know, filling that circle fully. Yeah, I think that's my last slide. Yeah. And I hope that was helpful and sort of seeing where I come from, and maybe if you guys have questions.
I think I speak for all of us when I just say thank you for sharing all of that journey. It was really wonderfully told, but also just kind of took us all in different directions in terms of your process and the impact of your work. And so we appreciate that very much. I think we do have time for maybe one or two questions. So I'd love to just open it up. I don't know that we necessarily have to talk about what that means for the fabric workshop yet. We're still very much at the very beginning of our relationship together and what we're going to experiment with and what we're going to decide as a group with education in our studio and the whole team here, what we're going to do together. But, you know, I think I can definitely ask you what you've been thinking about, but I would love to just open it up to the crowd first, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, sorry for not using my camera, but I wanted to ask, since I really admired how you went from the dangers of cultural appropriation into how you started sculpting the body and like doing other things with bodies, with the dressing as a result of that. And I wanted to ask if for you it makes sense to reinsert sexuality into the work and whether it feels more authentic, or if you found that it was best to just like refocus your attention.
That's a really good question. And I actually, if anybody knows who the artist Kent Monkman is, he did a piece recently that was incredibly controversial. And if you look on his Instagram, you can read a lot of the comments around that. And one of my really close friends is this artist, Deani Reynolds Whitehawk, and she's like, she's super dope. But we spend hours, you know, talking about theory and all kinds of things. And that is such an interesting conversation because, you know, what is healthy sexuality looks different to lots of people, right? And I think that's something that to me is really scary to talk about, but almost because it's scary, it's the thing that should be talked about, right? And how do we approach that carefully, and how do we do that with consciousness, and how do we do that without perpetuating specific stereotypes and things that might hurt people, right? Like, how do we be careful? And I don't know, I think that's actually really cool. Like, what would that even look like, right? And how do we approach that from a place of incredible trauma and with people who have been incredibly traumatized? Yeah, and I'm willing to have that conversation because I think it's an interesting one. And if anybody can spend some time, you know, on Instagram looking at Kent Monkman's piece and all the comments on it, there's like 300. It's crazy, but it's totally worth it. Like, I would build an entire seminar in a college around that conversation alone, and his work and that conversation. I think, yeah. It's if you forgot, it's Kent Monkman. If you want to do that research, it's way interesting.
I think I wanted to just maybe as a last question, because I know we're running out of time, but
oh, yeah.
When we had our initial conversation, there's a lot of people that collaboration is really important to you, and there's a lot of people that you wanted to, or not even specific actual people, but groups of people or historians, experts, whatever it may be, but you're also really interested in the conversation of like, who's the best like cobbler in Philadelphia, like these kind of people like that. And I thought it was worth talking about, like what is that insider knowledge and how do we access that? So can you talk a little bit about why that's important and who you want us to reach out to and find for you in this process?
I'm super interested in place and how place creates aesthetic, right? Just like Española and the lowrider culture. And, you know, the more we're in the media world, like, for instance, I have my nephews and nieces are like in their early teens, right? And, you know, I get teased a lot for my accent, which I try and get rid of it as much as possible. But when I was in graduate school, I got teased a lot for my accent. And I realized I grew up in Española, and if I talk to people from Española, it changes a lot, right? It goes back into like a really strong accent. So I have like a really strong Española accent. And I noticed that my niece and nephews don't have it, you know, because they're spending their time on YouTube and on Facebook and Instagram, and like their accents are now this sort of Pan-American sound that almost sounds like LA or something. The way I hear it, it sounds like LA or something like that. And it kind of makes me sad because as much as I've tried to get rid of my accent, it's also a part of being in a place, right? It's a very strong part of being in a place. When I was in Rhode Island, I was hanging out with, I made friends with some Wampanoag people, and I realized when I started listening to name the places of names, the names of places and how they came from the Wampanoag language, right? So like Pawtucket, Wampanoag, you like listen to the way things are said. And I realized that the entire accent of that area, which because like Boston or New York and coffee and there's dead bodies floating in the water, you know what I mean? I was like, that kind of thing was actually indigenous. That's an indigenous way of holding your mouth. And when I realized that, I was like in love with it. You know, it came from like, wait, what is this? To like, oh wow, that's amazing, because it's a place. It comes from the earth. The actual place created this thing. And that's what I'm looking for. Like if we're in Española, you know, there's people that are rooted in a place that created an entire culture around, we're here and this is what that looks like. To be here and the intense histories and all the ugly things and the beautiful things of what it means to be in a tricultural place like this. But what of where you are? Where are those things? Where are the things that the accent comes from? What are, you know, the shops that still have a landline and no website, right? And only people that know somebody, you know, like I needed a plumber the other day and I couldn't find a plumber without calling some big city thing up in Santa Fe, and they had to drive 45 miles out of their way. And I was like, I called somebody who gave me their number, and I had to call their kid, and then they showed up. You know what I mean? And that kind of thing to me, and they're looking at me like, who are you? And then I open my, hey, what's up? How are you today? You know what I mean? And they start talking to me and they're, oh, we're cool, you know, because we're from here, and who do you know, and who's your family, kind of thing, right? And to me, place is what really creates culture, right? And what I want to know is to find those people and without, and this is where we have to be careful, and I want to have another conversation about that, is how do we do this without being extractive? How do we honor it without being appropriative? Like, how do I enter into a space and be like, I'm still Rose from Santa Clara and Española, and this is what I have to offer, and I want to see how we can highlight or see what you have to give to this situation, or even just say, what does it mean to be from here, and what is your family history, and what does that experience look like, you know? Instead of going in and being like, I know what's best for this place. Like, how do we listen instead of talk over everybody else? That's just a thought.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Karen, it's Jessica Silverman. Hi, Rose. Hi. Hi. I'm walking my dog. Apologies. But I would love to, you're working on a lot of projects right now. And you move between the studio and writing. And I wonder if you could maybe touch upon how your degree, excuse me, in creative writing continues to play an important role in your practice.
Thanks. So the reason that I went to graduate school to start with was because I was really interested in writing the academic text on Indigenous aesthetics, right? And actually led a seminar with my brother on Indigenous aesthetics, and used the students at I as sort of a think tank around what is this Indigenous aesthetic. And because of that seminar itself, it kind of transformed my whole writing. I wanted to write something super scholarly for students to, you know, to use. And so I think my writing has a lot to do with my interest in the conversation itself. I want to have those conversations. I want to, like, the exciting thing to build a seminar around Kent Monkman's controversial painting would just be so exciting, not because I have an answer, but because I want to learn and I want to hear what everyone thinks and see how you know, we can communally navigate something. And so writing often sort of reflects something back to me that I can work through. And it almost puts my thoughts down so that I have to revisit them and, you know, challenge my own thinking as much as possible. You know, over and over, it's a really amazing reflection. Yeah. Does that answer? Cool, awesome. Well, thank you everybody for hanging out today. It's a big crowd. It's a real big, quiet crowd.
I think we're all just taking it all in. It was really nice to hear from you directly about what motivates you and why. So it's quiet because we're grateful. So thank you.
Well, thank you too. Thank you for everything.
Thank you very much.